Welcome to the NYU Steinhardt Jazz Interview Series. And today we have one of the great jazz basses, pop basses, record producer, band leader, you name it, Mr. Marcus Miller. Welcome, Marcus.
How you doing, Dave?
I want to talk about how you've had such an amazing career for so long. Can you talk, you know what, and I want to frame it by saying, I know you grew up in Brooklyn, and there's an old phrase, talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not.
Very true.
So was there opportunity growing up in Brooklyn?
Well, I grew up, born in Brooklyn. At the age of 10, we moved to Queens, Jamaica, Queens. And this is a very special area in terms of music. The dynamic of New York housing was that not every borough, Staten Island, Manhattan, Brooklyn, not every borough had basements in the homes. But in Queens and in the Bronx, there were basements. And this is a big deal because parents encouraged their kids. If their kids showed a little desire to explore music, parents encouraged it. Sent them down the basement, that way they know where their kids are. You know, and they can hear that the kids are downstairs. And so we had this basement culture in Queens where if you went one block, you could stand outside on the corner and hear what the other band, what the competition band, what funk songs they were rehearsing, you know, and then you'd run back to your basement and make sure you had that song ready to go at the talent show. You know, it was a musical environment. Also, so that was our generation. Also in Jamaica, Queens, because of the proximity to New York City, a lot of jazz musicians lived in Jamaica, Queens, because it was affordable, but you could still get to your gigs. So at different times, we had Count Basie, we had John Coltrane, we had Brooke Benton, Lenny White was a mentor of mine, Billy Cobham was there, so it was a really musical environment, and so many great musicians were there all together feeding off of each other. So, and then you eventually get to the point where you're ready to do some gigs, and Manhattan is right there. So when you talk about opportunity.
But on top of that, your father was a musician.
My dad plays the piano and the organ, so every Sunday he was pulling out the stops at the African Orthodox Episcopal Church in Brooklyn. His dad was the minister. And yes, after those services on Sunday, the whole family would go downstairs into the church basement and perform for each other. My dad's cousin was Wynton Kelly. So every once in a while, Wynton would show up, a great, incredibly great jazz piano player from the 50s and the 60s. And all of our aunts sang, so it was a very musical environment. So by the time I hit Jamaica, Queens, I was already primed to be a musician.
Well, I had read that Wynton Kelly was related to you. Was that your connection to Miles?
Well, Wynton passed in 1971. I was 11 or 12 years old. Hadn't discovered jazz on my own yet. I just knew Wynton was a great piano player, and he did something called jazz. My dad was a classical guy. My dad played hymns, he played Beethoven, Brahms, and so that was what was happening in my house, and my mom was a Ray Charles fan. Okay, so I grew up with that, knowing that Wynton was great, and I'd hear him play in the church basement on Sundays from time to time. There's a guy named Kenny Washington, who was my classmate in high school. Kenny Washington is a great jazz drummer, and I met him in high school at the LaGuardia School. It was called Music and Art at the time. And Kenny heard me playing my little funk lines. He said, "Man, you need to learn how to play jazz." And I said, "Why?" He said, all the great musicians play jazz." That was a good enough answer for me. So I used to go visit Kenny, who lived in Staten Island. I used to go visit him every Sunday. And he was my age, but he was like this old dude, this old soul, you know what I mean? His father had 5,000 records, and he would just play me the history of jazz, you know, just said, like, this is Louis Armstrong, this is Duke Ellington, this is Charlie Parker. And I said to him, I got a cousin, man, who plays jazz. You ever heard of Wynton Kelly? And Kenny, and then he starts pulling out all these Wynton Kelly records. And he sends me home that first night with cassette tapes full of Wynton Kelly performances. Miles Davis stuff and trio stuff that Wynton did with Paul Chambers and Jimmy Cobb. And I became like a raving Wynton Kelly fan. You know what I mean? I went, and of course, now I go home and open up my dad's record collection. Of course, there's all these Wynton Kelly records at home that I didn't know about. So that was my connection to Wynton.
So Miles knew you were with Wynton, or you were.
The first thing I told Miles when I met him is that I was Wynton's cousin, and he said, "Oh wow, man, he had a beautiful touch." That's what he said.
Did he have any stories?
No, he didn't have a lot of stories. It took me a while to get Miles to start telling the stories about the guys. You know what I mean, from the 40s and the 50s. Once I got him going, I got a lot, but it was more about, you know, his memories, his really sharp memories were about that magical time that we all have when we're 19, 20 years old. You know, a lot of people have college memories, you know what I mean, at that age. Miles had memories of New York City, you know, searching out Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and all the guys there. So he talked a lot about
Well, I want to focus on you, but was Miles open about talking about his early days with Parker?
Oh, yeah.
What did,
I mean, once, you know, I had two periods with Miles. One, I was his bass player. I played for a couple of years in his band. And then I told him I'm going to leave. I want to develop as a producer, composer stuff. And I ended up coming back to him a few years later and working with him on a few albums in the studio. And it was just me and him one-on-one. And that's when I started getting all these stories. But yes, a lot of stories about Charlie Parker, Dexter Gordon, J.J. Johnson, Gil Evans, Bud Powell. He loved Bud Powell. Max Roach. He talked about all those guys.
you ever talk about Birth of the Cool?
Not so much, because Birth of the Cool was still kind of a fresh memory, because at the same time that I was playing with Miles, he had reconnected with Gil Evans, who had done a lot of those arrangements for Birth of the Cool. So that wasn't a memory, that was like a current thing. He was still playing lines on his trumpet, and Gil was taking them and transposing them, you know what I mean? And these guys were so tight, you know what I mean? And so it was a current thing. So he wasn't reminiscing about that at the time.
The reason I say that is because initially, from what I understand, it should have been Charlie Parker that was supposed to front that band.
Okay.
And he kind of bowed out because he wasn't really an ensemble player. But they needed somebody who was had a large enough name that would push that forward.
That could very possibly be. He never said that. The only thing he talked about regarding Birth of the Cool was techniques, arrangement techniques that he wanted me to try to incorporate in what I was doing. You know, he said, you know, Gil used to do an 11-note chord staccato and just 2 notes would sustain. Check this out. That's nice, right? Or he'd say, listen to this contrary motion. He didn't play the piano. All his demonstrations was just atonal because he was just moving his hands on the piano. But he was giving me these concepts, and that was what I got from his Birth of the Cool experience.
So how did you become such a great arranger?
Well, you know, coming up in Jamaica, Queens, like I was telling you, we had some mentors, and you know, this guy named Denzel Miller, who's I had a band. He was a band leader, and he said, "You are not a complete musician unless you're composing and arranging, and you're doing the whole thing." It wasn't an option. A lot of musicians grow up feeling like, I'm a musician, and some people are arrangers, some people are composers. The guys that I grew up with, you know, said, you're not complete unless you're doing it all. So from a very young age, I was writing my little tunes, you know what I mean, and arranging. My neighborhood band, I was making arrangements and doing trial and error.
And did you learn stuff at Music and Art?
Yeah, I learned a lot at Music and Art from the professors, from the instructors, and also from the other kids around, you know what I mean, like Kenny Washington, who I was just talking about, you know. Then I went to Queens College. I was going to go to the conservatory, Mannes, on clarinet, because that was my major in high school. But in that summer between high school and college, I said, man, I don't know if this is the right move for me, going to the conservatory on clarinet. Not a lot of opportunities on the clarinet. And I'm playing bass. I'm not as good a musician on the bass, but I'm working all the time. You know what I mean? It seems like this is the route. So instead, I went to Queens College and took my orchestration composition courses there too, and got a lot of great instruction there also.
Did you finish there?
No, like 2-3 years in, the instructors were telling me, you got to get out of here, man. I just saw you playing on so-and-so's record, and I just saw you. I said, I need something to fall back on. That's what my parents were telling me. And one instructor said, dude, you need to fall forward. You know, you got all these opportunities in front of you. You can always come back, you know, that whole thing. So once I got the gig with Saturday Night Live in the house band, I convinced my dad to let me take a break from college, and he said, okay. It was funny, man, because I was playing with Roberta Flack at the time, And we played a gig at Radio City, and my parents came. My dad loved Roberta Flack. And he came backstage, he and my mom, and Roberta took my dad aside and said, Mr. Miller, I was a school teacher. Nobody values education more than me, but I am telling you that your son is immensely talented and you have nothing to worry about. He is going to be very successful. And coming from her, that did a lot. That went a long way.
Wow. So it goes back to that idea of talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. So you could have been as good as you are somewhere in the world and not have ever been seen. So what was the bridge that allowed you, how did, like Roberta Flack, how did all of a sudden you're not just playing with these people, but it's probably this led to this, led to this, led to this?
Well, there's two things. One is simply growing up in New York, because a lot of kids, as you say, they're in another part of the world, and at a certain point in their life, they have to make a decision to move to a big city like New York and then establish themselves. By the time I came out of high school, by my second year of college, I was gigging all over Manhattan. I was a bass player, and everybody needs a bass player. There were no computers making music, so I was playing on commercials, I was playing on anything that needed music. So that's just kind of something I didn't have control of. I just simply was in the environment. But the second thing is recognizing opportunity when you see it, and you do have control over that. And lots of times those opportunities weren't paying opportunities, right? You weren't getting paid. Somebody says, hey man, I got a gig at this club, and it's, you know, whatever we get at the door, that's gonna be our pay. We might not make anything. And I had a knack for taking gigs that led to other situations, you know. And I think that's, when I talk to young musicians, when I observe young musicians, I can tell the guys who have that knack and the guys who just for some reason don't get it. They can't figure out how to make this connect with this. You know, if I were gonna add a third quality to that, it's you have musicians who impress the audience, and you have musicians who impress other musicians, you know. And if you were gonna play basketball, if you're gonna use a basketball analogy, the guy who gets the rebounds and delivers the ball, the guy who gets kneed in the groin, gets elbowed in the chin, but he's the one who's fighting for the team. And his stats never make it into the box scores. But everybody on the team knows that without this guy, we wouldn't be where we are. A great bass player who connects the drummer to the rest of the band, a bass player who recognizes that the drummer rushes every 8 bars, and instead of having an argument with the guy, rushes with him and then gently pulls him back. These things are talents that a lot of musicians never figure out. And that's what causes other musicians to say, hey, you gotta call this kid, Marcus. You gotta call this kid for this, you know, because they love playing with you, you know what I mean? And that's really important.
You've worked with so many great artists early on. Were you feeling any sense of intimidation at all?
When I would get the calls, you know, we were all part of this service called Musicians Registry. And there were no cell phones, so if anybody who was looking for you, who didn't know you, needed to get in touch with you, they would call the registry and say, I'm looking for Marcus Miller. So you'd call your service a couple of times a day, and they say, hey, you know, Quincy Jones needs you, or Grover Washington Jr. needs you. And so those moments were pretty freaky, you know what I mean? Once the music started, there wasn't a lot of nervousness, because for me, music was so important and so organic to me that my only concern was, how do I make this music sound good, you know? So when you get to the studio and you're unpacking your instrument, you have to make small talk with McCoy Tyner. That's difficult, that's intimidating. But once the music starts, it was like, I'll be nervous later. I gotta make this happen.
So what's your connection with Michael Urbaniak?
In the late 70s, Michael Urbaniak was a really heavy presence, the New York fusion scene. You know, he was from Poland, and he had a different concept. You know, fusion musicians had just begun to explore odd meters. John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu, and Chick Corea, Return to Forever. They were all starting to experiment with this. And here's a guy from Poland who odd meters is like falling out of bed for him, because that's part of the actual pop culture, popular culture in Poland has a lot of odd meter stuff in it. So he brought this influence to New York. And for some reason, he would hire like funky cats and then force them to play these odd meter things. You know, we're all used to playing on the one, And he's got us playing in 9/8, 11/8. It's very simple. And we're like, you know, but for me, it was a great challenge. And we had a great band, man. We had a drummer named Yogi Horton, who played with Luther Vandross for many years after. Kenny Kirkland was in the band. He was a piano player. And myself, man. And we really had some great experiences with Michael. He always had a gig. Sometimes we were playing at Beefsteak Charlie's, you know, on Fifth Avenue in front of a plate glass window with people passing us by. But we were working all the time. Michael, his wife at the time was Ursula Dudziak. And so we just played all over New York. You know, I was 18, 19 years old at the time. It was a great experience.
Wow. So you talk about the title Fusion, or the moniker Fusion. How has that changed over the years? Because I was watching some interviews with you with Ramsey Lewis, for instance, and he was calling what you play contemporary jazz. So it's moved between fusion, contemporary, smooth jazz, whatever.
Yeah, man, I don't know, man. Those are just,
Those
you
are
know,
names.
I say fusion just because in the 70s there was a very specific mix of musical styles that was very easily identifiable and marketed as fusion. But in a broader sense, jazz is inherently fusion. You know what I mean? It's just taking, you know, the elements from Europe that they got hit with, the slaves got hit with it when they were down in areas like New Orleans, and combining that with the African rhythms and the Caribbean rhythms, and it was just like America. It was a mix of all these styles. And so I will talk about fusion in the 70s, and we all know what that means. You know, that's
Right.
That's, you know, Weather Report and those guys. But fusion in general, as far as I'm concerned, that's the heart and soul of jazz. And I think without that, this music would have been over a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think we're about the same age. And when I was growing up, it was like Return to Forever and Weather Report and Oregon and so many of those groups that had really fused the new music through Miles and that was pretty significant. That was pretty deep music, and a lot of that sound, the intention remained, but the depth kind of left. You know, when we move into CD 101, when that station started, it was some pretty significant music that slowly got funneled into maybe one or two things.
Well, the thing about original fusion was that, you know, let's talk about the elements that made fusion in the 70s. We'll talk about rock music, we'll talk about jazz music, maybe funk, R&B, okay? In the early original days of fusion, whoever the artist was, he was one of the top in the world at one of those styles, okay? Chick Corea, Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis, Tony Williams. These are some of the early fusion musicians. They were all like the best musicians in jazz at the time.
Right.
So it's like Italian cooking. When they tell you how to cook in Italian, they say the most important thing is to come up with the great ingredients, right? Have great ingredients, then you don't have to do so much work. Just put them together, it's gonna be great. And so the first generation of fusion musicians were either great jazz musicians or great rock musicians like Jeff Beck, you know what I mean? They were great something. They were top of the field at some other style that they were using, and they were taking other influences, right? That made a very special mix. Second generation were guys, in my opinion, who played decent funk, decent rock, decent jazz, but they weren't incredible at any of the styles. They actually considered themselves fusion musicians. And that's when the thing started getting watered down, you know? And then we got another level, and then a couple of guys decided to have a light moment. A couple of these great musicians had a light moment, recorded a light song, and the thing went crazy, you know what I mean? And the record company said, here's $1.5 million, please do that again. And next thing you know, we have this offshoot of fusion called, you know, I think for a while they were calling it, I forget the names, man, but like contemporary jazz, and the smooth jazz, you know. Smooth jazz was a name that they came up with it in a marketing meeting, you know.
Yeah.
They had a test group, they had a bunch of people listening with headphones and biofeedback dials. And they said, what would you call this music? Oh, it's beautiful, man, it's relaxing me. I would call it smooth jazz, which is a jacked up name because it implies that like the other jazz is rough and difficult
Yes.
and incomprehensible. You know what I mean? But anyway, my main point
You could
is
take
that
a nap through the whole thing and it wouldn't wake
you
you,
could take
up.
but you know what? The problem is there were some guys who did the hell out of that. And, you know, a lot of times, stuff that you come up with that's really well done and beautiful gets messed up by the imitators, so that people start blaming you for the horrible imitators. You know what I mean? Because when you talk about Pat Metheny, right, or you're talking about some of the stuff that David Sanborn did in the early days, you know, or Bob James, that stuff was killing. You know what I mean? It was Ahmad Jamal. You know what I mean? There was even Kind of Blue. You put that on for dinner, man. That's a good meal. You know what I mean? But what happened was these other guys who maybe aren't as creative, as inspired, whatever the word is, they came in and did their version of that, and the thing just started getting watered down to the point where you don't even want to hear from Bob James anymore. You know what I mean? And that's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, you've worked with Bob James. Did you? Yeah, you worked with Bob James. And you worked a lot with Sanborn. And you worked with Grover Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think of all those guys as the original guys. And, you know, I haven't talked to Sanborn about this, but what do you think he thinks? That so many guys sound like him.
It messed with his head, man. It messed with his head. I kept telling him, man, this is the highest compliment. You are literally the most influential alto saxophonist since Charlie Parker. I'm not talking about, because, you know, of course you can imagine his reaction. Like, just shut up, man. That's not even, I said, I'm not talking about style or even talent. I'm just talking about how many guys today play like David Sanborn, okay? How many guys play like Cannonball? How many guys play like Jackie McLean? How many guys play like James Spaulding? You know, how many guys play like all these great alto players? I mean, they're all influential, but man, you walk into any club anywhere in the world, and if the guy has an alto sax, there's a good chance he's gonna be playing those Sanborn licks, which was difficult for Dave, man. At a certain point, we went in the studio, because I produced his albums for like 15 years. Man. We went in the studio, and he said, I'm not playing any of my licks. I said, why not? He said, I can't. I turn on the radio, and I hear these guys playing my stuff in the wrong environment, the wrong situation, with the wrong nuance, you know? They just have the sound, and it's just like an automatic, and I'm becoming a cliche, and I have to break out of it, you know? And I said, why are you gonna let other guys kick you off your own style, you know? But that's how much it affected him. And we went through a whole album where he would get an inspiration to play, he's improvising, he'd get an inspiration to play, and then double think that and play something else, you know? And so that's how much it affected him. He worked his way through it, you know what I mean? And when you hear him now, he's grown, you can see the process, you know? I think another thing with him is that the way he gets to those licks that we all know is not what you think. You know, you hear an F7 chord and everybody goes, oh yeah, da, 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 da. No, he's gonna go this way, he's gonna try that, and come to that final lick that we know from around the corner. And it always has something extra to it that the imitators don't have. So I've seen that with a lot of guys. I saw it with Miles, you know, I saw it with Luther Vandross, you know. I had the honor of working with people who were innovators at what they do. Shaka Khan, Aretha Franklin, you know. I see how they get to their thing, and it's completely different from what people think, you know.
Well, certainly Miles is a classic example of somebody who, when he was starting off at your age, like 19 years old, playing with Charlie Parker, and you look at the end of his career where he's playing Cyndi Lauper tunes or whatever and making them his own, he certainly, I don't think he would ever go back and play My Funny Valentine.
No, he wouldn't play My Funny Valentine, but he'd play the current version of My Funny Valentine. Meaning, you know, the bebop guys were playing Broadway songs. They were playing pop songs and just stretching them and opening them up and showing people the possibilities of these pop songs, because there was some beauty in those songs that maybe not everybody could hear, and some depth in these songs that maybe not everybody could hear. But Miles and Bird and all the jazz musicians who took these show tunes and these tunes that, you know, can you imagine Miles walking in the studio and going, hey man, we're gonna play this song from this Disney film, Snow White. Guys, Miles, come on man, what? Paul James was like, oh man, this is sweet, you know what I mean? And all the rest of us who heard that said, man, I would have never thought. And the combination of a tune that's part of America's soul, because entertainment songs, you know, show tunes and pop songs, they go into America's soul. The combination of taking those songs that are part of you and then opening them up and showing you something that you never believed was possible, that's one of the most magical things.
But you know, the interesting thing, when it comes from the artist is attracted to a song as compared to a record label. Like when Bossa Nova came out, it's like everybody had to do a Bossa Nova. Coleman Hawkins does a Bossa Nova record.
Yeah.
Or I had read at some point that Columbia Records wanted Monk to do a tribute to Blood, Sweat and Tears.
Yeah, that dude's not in the music business, I'm sure, right now, you know. But yes, you do have that. And that's something that every musician, if they stay around long enough, is going to have to deal with. You know, we had Bossa Nova, we had Boogaloo, right? I mean, everybody had a Boogaloo record.
Sidewinder.
Yeah, Sidewinder. And we had funk, right? We had disco. You know, there's a disco giant steps out there. You know what I mean? We had techno, Herbie Hancock, Rocket. You know, we had hip hop, us three. You know, that's part of it. And how you negotiate that pressure, because either you avoid it all the way around and just continue to play your thing, or you take on the challenge. Herbie Hancock took on the challenge. He won. You know what I mean? Because maybe it was him, he came to it naturally. Maybe some record company guy said, hey man, you should try doing some, you know, some breakdance beats, you know? But Herbie, and I've seen a lot of musicians do that, somebody gives them an idea which is basically a stupid idea. The guy he's not thinking deeply. And Herbie goes, and this is how Herbie is. Either I just dismiss this guy as an idiot, or I go, well, if I asked myself to do that, how would I do it? And all of a sudden you get. And we as the listeners know, this guy came to this in an honest and deep way. This guy just did what the record company said to do. You know, you have different ways of dealing with this input, you know what I mean, from outside. And how you do it, I think, really tells the difference.
So you as a producer, when you have an executive producer come at you with like some stupid idea, you've learned your lesson, I guess.
I had a guy, Miles and I were working on a movie soundtrack called Siesta. The producer came in and said, Marcus, this thing needs a blues. And I'm like, this thing is filmed in Madrid, right? The temporary score, before we wrote the new music, was sketches of Spain. Where does the blues fall in all of this? You know what I mean? So my first reaction was like, that's a ridiculous idea. Then I said to myself, just for kicks, if I were gonna do a blues in Madrid, what would it sound like? All of a sudden I started writing this stuff. And I said, Miles, try this melody. I wrote this stuff out for Miles. And he's looking at it, he goes, go to the Five and Dime and get me some reading glasses. And I run to the store, got him some reading glasses, put it on, and he plays a melody. And it was beautiful, you know what I mean? So rather than reject the idea, which I initially said, this is stupid, okay? I let it be, you know, a challenge for myself. And it turned out to be something that I probably wouldn't have arrived at on my own.
Wow, interesting. So how does that play into your career now? When you go out and perform, are you taking things from pop culture, from society, or trying to pull back and say, you know, this is really where my heart is?
A little bit of both. You know, I was never that dude who lived completely outside of mainstream. You know, I played basketball. You know, I practiced my butt off as a teenager, but I also did not separate myself. You know what I mean? So for me, the best music, the music that I really admire, is like Duke Ellington and Miles and even like Grover Washington Jr., Mr. Magic. Stuff that acknowledged the world that it was being created in and just said, here's a really artistic rendering of what's going on today. That's what I admire. To me, it's really easy to just be on your own thing and not address the world. You know, that's easy. And it's really easy to just completely address the world and not insert any of yourself in it. But to me, the magic area is where you take that thing, man, and you have people moving like they move to Duke Ellington's music, but you're hitting them in the head with all sorts of stuff that they might not otherwise have been able to digest because that rhythm got them locked up already. You know what I mean? And to me, That's where the sweet spot is.
You know, it's interesting. I teach jazz history, and I teach it to a lot of students from around the world, and everybody's familiar with what we probably call classic jazz, anything from the up to the 50s and early 60s, and Miles and Plug Nickel and those types of things. As we get into the fusion era, it's less so. And I don't know if it's because of the way we've been steered into a box with this is what jazz is. A lot of pundits will say jazz has got to have this swing to it, and it has to include these types of people. But when I start playing Return to Forever or Weather Report or whoever, I've never heard this before, meaning students. And so I think potentially there's it's time for a resurgence of this, because it's just not been in the public consciousness.
Well, every art form has an arc, a life arc, and you can't deny that. You know what I mean? And jazz, you know, from the beginning of the century, last century, you know, it comes up through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. By the time we get to the 50s, man, that thing has been distilled into some amazing stuff. You know, guys have taken the experiments from before and they've kind of developed it. And then, you know, we're talking about the 60s, which historically in our country, there was so much, it was so fertile because of what was going on, because music doesn't exist by itself. Musicians were reacting to this incredible stuff that's happening in our country. It was an amazing time, you know? And think about it, man. We went from Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, and by 1967, we're with John Coltrane. We're in interstellar space, okay? We had nowhere else to go, you know what I mean? So then this new beat came in, and we said, hey, let's incorporate this new fusion thing. Let's make fusion, okay? Fusion, to me, extended jazz's first arc from 10 more years. If fusion hadn't happened, it would have been over. You know what I mean? But there is fusion. Like, it depends on who you talk to, because, you know, the people I know, you play Mr. Magic, they're like, that was my jam. You know what I mean? It's almost like it actually started go-go music in Washington, D.C. Chuck Brown was playing Grover Washington's Mr. Magic at a club. The beat was so infectious, people were dancing, he didn't want to let it go. So they kept the beat going and played different songs on top of the Mr. Magic beat, and it started this music called go-go. That's how influential that stuff was.
Can you talk about Grover Washington?
He was, you know, he and Sanborn kind of started this thing that has these different names. And smooth jazz musicians consider them the godfather of the genre. And I think they probably roll their eyes because they're going, man, we walked the bar, you know? If Grover and David Sanborn were to sit together, you walked the bar? Heck yeah, I walked the bar. Did you walk the bar? Yeah, I walked the bar. And for people who don't know what walk the bar means, if you played blues back in the 50s and the 60s, at a certain point you had to jump up on the bar, go da 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 da, and get the people hollering. That was how you did it. You had to walk the bar. You had a connection with people. You knew what music did to people physically, and walking the bar was part of that. And the musicians who emulate Grover Washington and David Sanborn, they never walked the bar. You know, I talked to Eric Clapton. This is even jazz. I talked to Clapton. What do you think about so-and-so? I'll name some other rock hero. He said, you can tell he never played the blues. You know what I mean? Because underneath all of this stuff, right, if you know how to listen, there's depth. Now people, because it's shiny or there's a drum machine or whatever it is, some people that throws them off and they go, oh, it's just light. But if I know David Sanborn's sound, you know, I can hear, I can tell between him and the imitators, because there's roots that go down. And I think Grover and David and Bob James played atonal music for like 5 or 6 years. You know, he was really influenced by Cecil Taylor and these guys, you know. And you can hear that there's another thing. Joe Sample, who was another architect of this thing they call smooth jazz now, that guy, man, was at the Texas-Louisiana border playing in blues clubs where, you know, they're playing jazz and the patrons are saying, man, if y'all don't make us feel good real soon, we're gonna kick your asses and take your instruments. You have to walk back to Houston, you know? you have those kind of experiences, man, that gives you depth. You know what I mean? And these guys playing, smooth jazz, they haven't had those experiences. You know what I mean? So the unfortunate part about it is that Sanborn calls it suds and the beer. He said, I hear these musicians, they're just playing the suds and they don't have the beer, So I think it'd be good if we can get some of that back.
Now, what about you as a bass player? Who were the bass players that influenced you?
James Jamerson. I didn't know it was James Jamerson at the time. Particularly on the Jackson 5 records, I thought it was Michael's brother Jermaine playing the bass, and I thought he was the baddest 14-year-old bass player ever. And then later on, I found out that all those bass lines I was learning were played by James Jamerson. Not to take away credit from Jermaine, because he had to go on the road, sing, dance in the high heel platform shoes, and play those bass lines. You know what I mean? So he was pretty bad himself at 14, 15 years old. James Jamerson, then Rocco, who was the bass player from Tower of Power. I really loved him. Yes, Prestia. Yeah.
Prestia.
And then Larry Graham, heard Larry Graham, and he wasn't playing like this, he was playing like this. And that just blew my mind and everybody else in my neighborhood's mind, because it sounded like a drum and a bass at the same time. And it was just funky, and he was soulful. And that blew my mind. Then Stanley Clarke, he took some of that thumping and plucking, but he had the dexterity and the jazz sensibility. So he was incredible. And Jaco Pastorius. And then there was a bunch of funky cats like Pop Swell, who used to play with the Crusaders, and who else? And then on the jazz side, because like I told you, around 14, 15, I got turned on to jazz, and Paul Chambers was my guy. You know what I mean? He was the bass player who played the most with Wynton Kelly.
Right.
And I just loved his feeling, his combination of head and heart. You know what I mean? Sam Jones, Ron Carter, those are my three guys on the upright bass. Not that I played upright.
Did you ever play upright?
I played all the time at home, but for me, I grew up in this little 4 or 5 year period where you were allowed to play the electric bass solely. Sonny Rollins had an electric bass player in the 70s. Everybody had an electric bass. It was kind of a little groove that we were in for about 5 or 6 years. And my formative years are right then and there. So I played bass. I just finished a film score where I played all acoustic bass. But when I need to tell you who I am and tell you about my life experiences, I'm going to pick up a bass guitar.
Cool. Hey, let me ask you about NBC Sunday Night. You were with that for a couple years. What a great show. That was one of my favorite shows.
Oh, thank you. It was called, for the first season, it was called Sunday Night. And then the next season it was called Night Music, because it was coming on like 1 a.m.
Right.
And people were missing it with their VCRs because they were putting in 1 a.m. on Sunday. And it was, that's 24 hours earlier. You know what I mean? So they changed the name. But it was a great show.
That was one of the, probably the last time that there was this mashup of so many different musical styles and personalities.
On TV, yeah.
On TV.
Yeah, David Sanborn, it was his, he came up with the idea, and we all had a Saturday Night Live connection because David was in the band for a while when I was in the band. So Lorne Michael, who's the producer of Saturday Night Live, he said, yeah, let's try it, So basically, if you imagine Saturday Night Live, but just the music part, you know what I mean? But with an experimental edge, that's what it was. And Dizzy Gillespie and Bootsy and Miles and Javon from Brazil and John Zorn and Jeff Healey. Just Donald Fagen came on and hung out with us and didn't even sing. He just played the piano. He just wanted to be in the band. You know what I mean?
Wow. From
Steely Dan. So it was a great experience.
Why did that end?
It ended because it's expensive to do TV shows. I mean, and I think it was mostly just budget. It's just when you look back at a lot of these great TV shows, they ran for 2 years. Star Trek ran for 2 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we got a good run. We were actually proud of having strung it out for that long, But I think it's probably budgetary. I was just the MD for the first year, so I wasn't kind of privy to all the decisions, but that's what I suspect.
What, that was 2 years? Was that, yeah.
2 years. I did the first year as the MD. I left. George Duke took over because Miles was getting ready to start up another album, and I wanted to continue what I had started with him. So, but I came back on as a guest producer and brought Miles on the show, and Javon, the Brazilian singer, and that was a really cool show.
So, what do you think about the music business now today?
You know, it's completely different. You know, it's not centralized, which has its good points and bad points. You know, what's good about it is that there's nobody now telling you you need to do a pop version of this song, a disco version of this song. The bad part is when you come up with something great, it's really hard to get it to everybody like you used to be able to do, you know? And that's not just jazz, it's hard to create, to get to everybody. Like Michael Jackson, you know, when Thriller came out, everybody's grandmother had it, everybody's mother had it, you had it, you know, your young cousins had it. It was a universal phenomenon. And that's harder to do because everybody's on the internet, on the website that they like, you know, checking out the music category that they like, and it's harder to get to people. And when you narrow it down to jazz, it's even harder. You can do whatever you want now.
Right.
Because there's no record company. But not as many people are going to hear it. Why? Because there's no record company. You know what I mean? So it's a double-edged sword.
Well, in the record stores, people would come in and they could browse, or there would be displays saying this is the latest Blue Note record or whatever.
Right.
Check it out. Now, younger people that never had that experience, they just go online and they don't know what to look for. There's nobody telling them, or if there are people in the world telling them, they're just very specific.
And those people don't have, like you're saying, those people don't have a big enough platform to influence like a whole generation. You know, we used to have like one DJ in R&B. It was Frankie Crocker. You know, he was a DJ in New York who, you know, you listen to Frankie to see what was happening, you know? And they had DJs like that in the Delta, you know, and they had people on TV who were telling you what's happening. We don't have that. And without stars, because this is how you create stars, and without stars, the whole genre suffers. You know, you can say what you want about Maynard Ferguson, about Buddy Rich, about Chuck Mangione, about Miles in some periods of his career. But let me tell you, without them, people don't get turned on to the stuff that you actually love, you know?
Right.
And that's really important. Like, think about a jazz festival, man. You know, the jazz musicians, the guys who are playing more like classic jazz, mumbling, man, this group, you know, I'm saying, dude, this festival exists because that group is playing at 9 p.m., okay? That brings the whole thing financially into a possibility, you know?
Right. What about the dichotomy between vocal music and instrumental music? I mean, I grew up on instrumental music. Like you were saying, in the 70s, it was Chuck Mangione, it was Maynard Ferguson for Miles. You could hear that stuff on AM radio.
Yeah. People are, you know, I do think the attention span was much longer 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think if you watch a classic movie from the 1940s, the thing is 2.5, 3 hours long, and it's deep, you know what I mean? And I just think that people just have more stuff going on in their lives now and don't really have the patience to really listen to an instrumental song. The thing we all have to at least admit is that the human voice is the primary means of communication, and it goes to a part of our brain we have no control over, you know what I mean? So when you have a little baby and you play that baby instrumental music, that's cool. It probably, if it's good music, will affect the baby. When you have somebody singing, that baby's gonna pay attention. That's just, try to get around that if you can, if you like, but it's not gonna happen, okay? That being the case, there was room back in 1950s, 1970s even, there was room for instrumentalists to express themselves, you know what I mean? But the other thing was, there was an accessibility. You know, musicians like to blame everybody but themselves. But at a certain point, you know, there's a reason that Ahmad Jamal was so popular and so successful. There's a reason Ramsey Lewis was so successful. And there's a reason Miles in the 50s was so successful. As deep as that music was, it had handlebars, you know? And if you make, and by handlebars, I mean it had melodies that people could identify, even people who were progressive. It gave you something to hold on to. John Coltrane, man, there's an interview with John Coltrane in the 60s, and they said, you know, congratulations on My Favorite Things. You know, biggest selling record ever. And what have you been up to now? And Train said, trying to find another of my favorite things.
Wow.
There's nothing like a hit. I mean, hit has all these kind of negative connotations, but I'm talking about not those hits. I'm talking about the hits with depth. That's a home run, right? When you come up with A-Train, when you come up with those great songs that everybody knows from Duke Ellington or Count Basie, or you come up with some of those performances with Miles where you don't have to know anything about music, you didn't have to take a single course at NYU, you just go, this touches me. You know what I mean? That's a home run. And then it happens to have all the other stuff in it too, all the harmonies, all the depth. That means you can listen to it 25 years from now and still pull something from it. That's a home run. And we don't have a lot of home runs these days. People are shooting for singles and doubles.
But who do we have today that's hitting home runs?
Let's see. In my opinion, Robert Glasper is doing well. The only problem with Robert's situation now is that people who don't really investigate him think he's an R&B musician. You know what I mean? It's because he's got a bunch of singers on his record, great singers, and he's doing great arrangements. But he's bifurcated his career where he's got the Robert Glasper Experiment and he's got this kind of black music project, which is interesting and is doing well, and he's figured out a way to deal with it. But it's not the same as The In Crowd by Ramsey Lewis.
Right.
You know what I mean? Where it's Ramsey.
Right.
And what people are attracted to is Ramsey. You know what I mean? That's a whole another thing. So who's doing that today? There's not a lot of people doing it, you know. Esperanza has the potential to do it. You know what I mean? She has a potential where it's everything. It's a melody that just gets people, rhythm that connects the community, you know what I mean? And depth to it, you know. It's there, but it hasn't happened recently.
Now, at the same time, over the past several weeks, Chick Corea has been at the Blue Note, sold out every night. It's very expensive. People are looking, I don't know if they're looking for something that is recognizable from the past, or they're just inspired, or they just want to go see a name that they recognize.
It depends on what week.
Yeah.
Because Chick was there for is he still there?
Still there.
He's still there for 2 months. And each week is a different band. So one week he had the Electric Band, which is people who want to hear that incredible, complicated music from that period with Dave Weckl and Patitucci. And then I played with him for a week. We did a tribute to Miles. It was Wallace Roney, Kenny Garrett, Brian Blade, Mike Stern, and myself. And people just wanted to hear what we were going to do. They were like, we don't know which Miles they're going to pay tribute to. We don't know. But he's a great musician, and we're gonna go. Now, bear in mind, it's the Blue Note. It's not Madison Square Garden.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, and Chick Corea has developed this beautiful, sterling reputation as a musician of substance, you know. And he's gone through periods like Herbie, where he brought everybody into the game. Return to Forever brought a lot of kids into the game, into the jazz game. He said, hey man, I don't know, I love this music, it has rock, it has everything. I want to know everything this guy does. That's what happened to me when I heard Headhunters, you know? So now, he's been responsible for broadening the world of jazz, you know? At least the listening population, you know? Herbie too. So now they have everybody, you know? So you go to their concerts and people just, hey, I'm yours. Just take me where you're gonna take me. And that's a beautiful thing.
So Marcus, is there any words of advice or any wisdom you can give to students who are trying to follow your path or a path in music and creativity?
Well, yeah, of course, you know, they ask musicians that all the time.
Yeah.
And it's hard because, you know, my story is my story, my situation, my set of opportunities were unique. The time I was getting started, that was a unique time. You know what I mean? Like I was saying earlier, man, there was so many opportunities for a solid bass player back in 1979, 1980. You know, I was running, I mean, Miles was standing there on the stage, backstage, going, where's Marcus? You know, and I just got there from the airport and got in the back of the line of the band getting on the stage. He said, I know you just got here. But I was doing an Aretha Franklin date earlier in New York and he was up in Connecticut, you know. So I said, okay, I cut it a little too close. I need to be cool with that. But there's just a million opportunities. So what you try to do when you're telling a young person, giving them some advice, you just have to see, well, are there any generalities that I can think of that would apply today, right? So the thing I was saying earlier, not all your opportunities, not all your great opportunities are going to involve money, especially when you're young. You need to get as broad as you can. You need to have as many experiences as you can. You know, the more you limit yourself, the less chance you have for success. That doesn't mean you won't have it, because if you limit yourself and you happen to hit, resonate with people, and become successful, it'll be a great thing, because people will know you for that one thing you limited yourself to, and you know, you will become an icon. But if you narrow yourself and you don't resonate, you don't fall into that 0.1%, then you're sitting there with nothing, you know. If you're a bass player, people ask me, man, should I be a groove player or should I learn the solo? And my advice is, you don't have the right to choose. You need to be a well-rounded musician. Mm-hmm. That's what they told me. Same advice when they said, well, you know, I'm not a composer, I'm a player. I said, why are you at the age of 19, 20 years old defining yourself like that? Man, figure out a piano and write your tunes. Maybe you won't come up with anything, but you don't know what's in you, you know, especially if you're self-limiting. That's really a mistake, you know. So I tell people that. I tell people, like I was saying earlier, you have to make the rest of the musicians, as a bass player, feel good. That's your job. You know, people who don't play music, they say, what does the bass do? You know, and the classic descriptions, you just play them a track and then turn off the bass. And they go, whoa, what happened? The bass left, right? Your job is to hold stuff together, you know. I play bass guitar, and now, because in pop music, bass guitar in a lot of pop music isn't holding music together now. It's synths, you know what I mean? So guys who play bass guitar aren't having that experience of having the responsibility of holding a band together. Consequently, you hear a lot of guys playing 6-string extended range basses, and they're more like guitar players, you know, playing chords and lines, which is beautiful. But you say, wow, the guy never had to keep a party going, you know what I mean? And it's changing. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'm telling you, if you're looking at me as an example, you know, on YouTube, all you see is my slap solos, you know what I mean? But for the rest of the 2-hour concert, you know what I mean? I was holding the band together. You know, I was making sure that the drummer is integrated into the band, you know, and making sure that the soloists are propelled, you know what I mean? When they come to that end of the phrase, I hit them with something that makes them step it up a level to the next day, you know, like being a human being, you know. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would tell musicians is that on the human side is that if you're the kind of person who in a conversation, when the other person is talking, you're thinking about the next thing you're gonna say, right? That's gonna come through your music, you know? We've all played with people who, when you're talking, they're not listening to you. They're thinking about the next thing they're gonna say. And I can hear it in drummers, you know, because bass player and drummers, we have these relationships, you know what I mean? Like, we have to work together. I can hear when the guy's thinking about his fill that's coming up in 6 bars, instead of living right there and playing the music, you know? For drummers, I tell them a story about Steve Gadd in the studio. One of the first times I played with him, we got to the studio, and this producer who had a demo tape of the song we were about to record, and he plays it for us. And every other drummer I played with up until this point, when the demo was playing, they jump on the drums and start playing along with the demo, right? Oh yeah, I got it, yeah, you know, yeah, oh yeah, this is just a blah, blah, blah. Steve Gadd says, play the demo. The demo played all the way to the end. He says, play it again. Can I get a cup of coffee, you know? And they made him a cup of coffee, he's listening. He's talking to me about, you know, whatever he's talking to me about, listening. Play it again, you know? We were there for half an hour. He just kept telling the guy to play the demo, you know? And we're talking and listening. And then he finally goes to the drum set, you know, and he plays the thing, the first take. Every subtlety of this song was captured. every little detail that all the other drummers had plowed through because they started playing right along before they even heard that the third time the chorus comes around, you know, we took 2 beats out. The second time the verse happens, you know, there's a whole nother feeling, you know. He knew all that because he lived with the song, not even concentrating on it, just letting it seep into his psyche, you know what I mean? He gets on the drums and it's right. We played the song one time, the producer says, that's it, can we do it one more time just for fun? We do it one more time. He says, I can't think of a reason to keep you guys here any longer. We booked 3 hours, but it's done. We're out of there, you know what I mean? And that says so much to me, that experience, because it was like, at first it looked like he was not connected, that he didn't care. You know, he's more interested in his coffee, you know what I mean? But when you realize, no, he's living with the song, you know what I mean? And so by the time it was time to play it, he caught everything, man. It was beautiful. So, as a musician, man, you have to understand, what is your purpose, man? We're trying to tell a story. If we're a side man, we're trying to help somebody tell their story, you know what I mean? And we're trying to communicate, you know? If you're not interested in communicating, why are you on a stage? You know what I mean?
Right.
Stay home, you know? But if you're out here, man, you're trying to put across something. And so think about that as a group.
Marcus, thank you. It's a great pleasure to have you here
Pleasure,
today.
thank you.